My name is Lily. I'm 25 years old, and I'm from the state of Texas. What I'm about to share happened to me a few years ago when I was 19. I'm an only child, and my mother took care of me from birth. She always ensured my well-being and education. When I was in my senior year of high school, I realized that my mother was hiding something from me. I had suspicions for a few months, but she never said anything. She kept it a secret. She had her reasons. However, in recent days, I noticed she was much thinner, eating less, and her skin had a much paler tone than usual. I heard her vomiting, and I even started to find red stains on her clothes. One night while we were having dinner, I began to question her. I was very worried about her health and couldn't keep ignoring it any longer. My mother's name was Sarah. She was very serious and didn't even look me in the eyes. I didn't know how to lie to her. She told me she had visited a doctor, that everything was fine and not to worry. But for some reason, I didn't believe what she was saying. The next morning, we visited a doctor in our neighborhood. He prescribed medications, some of which were very expensive. He also recommended a lot of rest. My mother worked as a cashier at a supermarket. She had to stand almost all day, so I suggested she ask for some days off to recover. Her supervisors needed to understand that she was sick. She refused, telling me that the medications were too expensive and that if she left her job, she couldn't afford them. Besides, we needed the money. I was selling covered apples at a local store. Honestly, I wasn't making much money from it, but it contributed something to the household expenses. After a long conversation, I told her that I could work after school. This would give me some time to finish high school. Obviously, she didn't agree and told me not to bring up the topic anymore. Days passed, and my mother started taking the medications. At first, she seemed to improve. However, she continued going to work and barely rested. After a few weeks, everything went back to the beginning and even got worse. On certain occasions, I heard her saying she couldn't even sleep anymore. Without her permission, I went to apply for a job at a nearby stationery store. The woman told me she would hire me part-time. The pay wasn't much, but it could still help my mother. One early morning, I heard what sounded like her breathing stop. I rushed into her room, very worried. She was choking. I called a doctor, almost crying, and he immediately came to our house. Fortunately, he was able to stabilize her. I started crying beside her, telling her how much she meant to me and that I didn't want to lose her. I would take care of the house until she got better. I took her hand and through tears confessed that everything would be temporary, that she would soon get better and everything would return to normal. Now it was my turn to care for her and love her. I wish I could say everything went as planned, but unfortunately it didn't. My mother continued to deteriorate. The medications she was prescribed were much more expensive, and despite waking up early to make apples, staying up late doing classmates' assignments, and working evenings at the stationery store, it wasn't enough. For obvious reasons, I didn't tell her any of this. I always kept it a secret so she would stay calm. I didn't want to worry her. Besides, there wasn't much to be done. We had spent the few savings I had. I was desperate at night, crying because I couldn't find a solution. I had no idea what else to do. My last resort would have been to drop out of school, but it was my senior year, and I didn't want to lose it. I told myself I could take a break before starting college. However, I couldn't afford to lose my final year of high school, but my mother was getting worse, and I was running out of options. One afternoon, while I was at the stationery store, I heard two women complaining that their money didn't stretch anymore, and that they earned much more working as night companions than at their day jobs. I don't know why, but for some reason that stayed in my mind. That night, I couldn't think of anything else. It wasn't the first time I heard such comments. My schoolmates also made jokes about it. I wondered if it was true that working as a companion could help me with money. Seeing my mother lying in bed hurt me every day. The doctor said we needed the medications for her to improve. A few weeks later, I found myself on the streets of my city, getting the money my mother needed. It was very difficult to be on the streets in the middle of the night, standing on a corner and waiting for someone to approach me. I don't want to go into the details of the beginnings or who led me to it. It was purely necessity that forced me to do it. In my mind, I kept repeating that I would just wait to gather what was necessary. It would be easy to leave it behind. My mother wasn't stupid either. I wondered where she was getting the money. I simply told her that friends from college were supporting me. It hurt to lie to her, but it was all for her well-being. Thus, the first weeks passed. I hated what I was doing, and my mother didn't seem to be getting better. So I couldn't quit. Every time I left the house, I kept telling myself over and over that it was almost over, and that it would only be temporary. That night in particular, I was very distracted. I couldn't get the image of my mother out of my head. I wasn't paying much attention to my surroundings. Suddenly, I felt like a car was slowly coming up alongside me. When I looked up, I saw that it was a man. He didn't look very big, maybe around 30 years old. It seemed like he hadn't slept in nights. He had a long face and a few days' beard. He looked sad and worried, but he still smiled at me. "Are you okay?" was the first thing he asked. I looked at him for a few seconds and replied, "Yes, how can you help me?" After all, everyone wanted the same thing. He said he wasn't looking for anything that night. He just wanted to talk. I felt a bit uncomfortable and told him that I would charge him anyway. He accepted and gave me almost triple what I normally asked for. I got into the car. I hadn't paid much attention, but it looked new. I sat in the passenger seat. The man asked if I wanted to go somewhere specific. I only asked him not to go far from the city center, and that's what happened. He parked next to a park. The place was in the shadows. It was late in the morning, and people seemed to be sleeping. The man turned off the car and looked at me. There was silence. I stared at him without saying anything. I didn't know how to interpret the situation. I noticed his eyes starting to glaze over. Then he began to cry. Tears rolled down his face. "I can't take it anymore," he murmured in a low tone. "I'm desperate and don't know what to do." I just listened as the man looked at me with red eyes from the tears. "He's never going to leave me alone," he said, crying. "Who are you talking about?" I dared to ask, but he kept saying us and didn't answer my question. He was very hungry for money. He wanted to have it all. I thought he would help me. I believed it was easy and accepted his help. I made the biggest mistake of my life, and now he's after me. He won't even let me sleep. What he was saying started to make me uncomfortable. There was something in his words that scared me. The first thing that came to mind was that maybe I owed someone money, or that he was fleeing from the police. I want my simple life back. I want my peace and the people I need. I have everything material, but I can't enjoy it. The man was a sea of tears. Honestly, I wasn't understanding what was happening. "I'm sorry," I said softly. The man looked up straight at me and stayed silent for a few seconds. It seemed like he was looking at something, but there was no one in front of us. Only the shadows of the park's trees. "There's something following me, but it's not a person. It's a being, something that's not human. I made a pact with a demon," he said. The first thing that came to mind upon hearing that was that maybe the man was under the influence of some substance. What he was saying didn't make much sense. The man kept looking straight ahead. His attention was under a tree a few meters away. I wanted money. I wanted power. I wanted to have a life and show off to others. I don't know how he found me, but when he did, he told me he could give me everything I wanted. But now I'm terrified because I see him everywhere. He always has that mocking grin on his face, as if he knows I belong to him. He won't leave me alone. I'm sure. I wanted to leave. Somehow he was telling me that with a lot of confidence. His hands were trembling and his voice was breaking. Just now he was under the tree staring at me. I looked in that direction, but there was no one. Sometimes during the night, I feel his breath next to me. He starts to laugh and won't let me sleep. He whispers things in a language I don't understand, but something tells me he wants to take me with him. Something tells me I'm already doomed. The man kept crying like a child. I was nervous, looking around, trying to see that thing he was describing, but we were alone on a park bench. All I wanted was to leave. The man started to dry his tears, and when he looked back up, he asked me where that thing was that he could no longer see. The man turned around, and I did the same, but as expected, there was nothing. Suddenly, I felt a chill down my neck. I turned back to the rear seat and saw a lump sitting behind him. It was a man dressed in black, very tall. His face was hidden in the shadows, but he seemed to be smiling. I got scared and quickly opened the car door. I was sure that when I got in, there was no one else with us. My heart started racing. I grabbed my bag and began to run away from that man. He didn't even bother to get out of the car. He just watched me from the driver's seat, still with red eyes and crying with fear. He started saying, "I can help your mother," followed by a chuckle. That sent a shiver down my spine. It seemed impossible that he knew what was happening at my house. I stopped abruptly and turned around. He was standing right before the street lamp. Despite the distance, I could sense that the man was smiling. "I can cure her," he kept telling me, pointing a finger at me. I tried to ignore him, but he kept repeating the same thing. I continued walking. He was following my steps. He repeated his words again. "I can cure her." I nervously and annoyedly told him to leave me alone, that I didn't need anyone's help. I took out my phone and confirmed that I had already sent my location to my friend. "I know she's very sick, and if you don't do something soon, she's going to die." I felt my legs tremble. The man spoke with a lot of confidence. A chill ran down my spine. "How do you know all that?" I asked again. I froze and turned my face. I still had my pepper spray in my hand. Despite being far from me, his figure was very imposing. He was very tall, thin, and pale. His hands were long, and I don't know how to explain it, but his eyes had an abnormal shine. "Stop bothering me." "I'm not alone," I said loudly, trying to appear confident, even though his face was covered by shadows. I realized he was still smiling. His mouth was long, and he had a mocking smirk on his face. The man didn't move at all. It seemed like his body was completely rigid. I turned around and kept walking, hearing his footsteps behind me. After a while, I heard a guttural sound. I don't know how to explain it. It was like the sounds mute people make to communicate. I felt my legs weaken. A knot closed my throat, and I started to feel very cold. "Give me what I ask, and I'll cure her," he said, followed by those horrible sounds. At some point, I thought he was choking, but then he started laughing again. I could hear his mockery behind me. His footsteps echoed down the street. I didn't want to turn around. It was like every move that man made was heavy. Even his breathing sounded slow and deep. I was very scared. Again, I took out my phone. My hands were shaking badly. I started to feel very helpless. Tears began to stream from my eyes. The man was much closer to me. I could feel him. On my phone, I searched for my friend's number and called her without thinking twice. I started running as fast as I could. My house wasn't far, but I was scared he would follow me to the door. When I started to move away, I heard horrible screams. It was that man making them. It was like a lament, a screech. The shock hit me hard. I knew where I'd seen him before. It was the man who was in the car the other night, the black shadow from the rear seat. I ran faster. Tears started to fall from my face. I remembered everything he told me in the car, the pact I had made. I felt like my heart was going to burst out of my chest. He was behind me, getting closer and closer. I couldn't stop crying. I yelled for him to leave me alone, to please leave me alone. I didn't understand what was happening. I had no idea why he was following me. I looked at the screen of my phone. There was still no response from my friend. Maybe she was asleep. Fortunately, the streets around me started to look familiar. I wasn't far from home anymore. I turned my head to look at him and yelled in terror. I couldn't explain how he was moving. It was staggering, like he was struggling to walk. His hands were twisted, trying to maintain balance. He was dragging his feet. I couldn't stop crying. What demon was that? I shouted desperately. I want someone to come out of a house and help me. That man was going to catch up with me. He was very close. As I turned a corner, I encountered a group of men sitting on a bench. When they saw me, they got scared and quickly stood up. I shouted for them to please help me, that someone was following me. One of them peeked around the corner where I was coming from, but told me there was no one. I kept shouting that yes, someone was following me. A tall man dressed in black who had been behind me for several minutes. How could they not have heard me scream? Those laments were horrible. The other two men went to check, but there was no one following me. They looked at me very scared. I was crying, sure that what was behind me wasn't human, wasn't normal. Those screams, the sounds he made, how he moved. I kept trembling and telling them the same thing. Like a crazy person, I'm convinced they thought I was drunk, but I know what I saw. How could they have tried to calm me down? I wasn't stopping looking at the corner, waiting for that thing to appear with a mocking smile. They offered to walk me home. Under other circumstances, I wouldn't have accepted, but fear was so intense that I couldn't imagine walking alone the rest of the way. When I got home, I locked myself in my room to cry. I didn't want my mother to hear me, so I buried my head in the pillow. My body was still trembling, remembering everything that being told me. She didn't say anything, but she also started crying. I felt her body shake. I didn't want her to leave. I couldn't be alone. I needed her, just like when I was little. After that day, my mother started getting worse. I had to admit her to the hospital because she was struggling to breathe. That period of my life was very complicated. I remember not going out of that place at all. I neglected school and my responsibilities. I didn't even go out to get money during the nights. I felt like that thing was haunting my surroundings. I could see its shadow in the distance. Even that horrible feeling of discomfort that wouldn't go away without stopping. However, I never approached it again. That night in the hallway, I never saw him again. It was as if he had simply released me. I finished high school, but obviously, I didn't attend the graduation ceremony. Many people approached me wanting to help, but I was fed up with everyone and everything. I felt very annoyed with the world. I felt somewhat cheated. I did everything in my power to save her. I tried many ways to keep her with me, but nothing worked. In the end, I lost her. I miss my mother every day. I want to believe that she's finally at peace. It's the only thing that keeps me calm, that she's no longer suffering. Every night before sleeping, I pray for her. I'm sure she does the same for me. I wish I could have done more to help her, even just a little, to show my love and respect in various other ways. I know it's no longer useful, but I always try to bring her flowers. I spend hours talking to her, telling her about my day and my thoughts. I like to think that she listens to me and always hugs me before I sleep, just like when I was a child. Thank you very much for listening to this story. I'm very happy about the community we're forming. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to share it with your friends, like it, and subscribe. It would help us reach more people. Once again, thank you from the bottom of my heart.